You can, introduce yourself. I've already let the folks know that the Black Power Roundtable, because folks came to see the documentary, but they really came to see the Black Power Roundtable. So we wanted to give them a teaser before we give them the full throttle tomorrow. We just wanted folks to get excited, to have a reason to come back tomorrow, right? So, maybe if you do have a couple of minutes towards the end of our dialogue, you can ask if anybody in the audience has anything to share or any thoughts that they might want to speak on, and I can always unmute folks so that they can speak. But with that being said, Brother Rich, you can introduce yourself and go ahead and take it away.
So let me do this as a point of introduction. I was born Richard White Neal Jr. I was given the name of Wally Dunkar Bayete. I've been in Philadelphia all my life, now 65 years. I'm gonna call it strategic vision or wish is that Black Philadelphia, on one day, whether I'm here or not, operate as a national entity within this geographical space called Philadelphia, to support and supply the services and needs. And therefore, I've been kind of learning on this quest of learning what does Black Power look like, and who is African people in order to do that. So I've been running around Philadelphia trying to answer these questions, and now at the point where I hear there's a new generation in town, continuing that process of the formulating and critiquing what is Black Power. So I guess that would be how I introduce myself in the short. I've been a member of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, member of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, co-member of Philadelphia's NCOBRA, National, for reparations. So I've been engaged in, that part of, organizing, around the development of identity, and also a volunteer member of the African American Museum in Philadelphia at this present. So that would be an ideal of who am I? So should I, brother, should I be asking you, like we see that you're focusing on now two major questions, I think, right? And I'm asking this. One, observation of the 50 years of political formation, and does the vote have it actually delivered goods and services by the participation of the those who got, I'm calling them political entrepreneurs to Black people, and two, has Black Power been snuffed out as a political ideal that should be pursued coming out of the 70s? So let's deal with the first one. You're saying that over the last 50 years, the vote has not really delivered what some have said it was supposed to deliver for Black people in our spaces in general?
Wow. So I would argue, Brother Rich, and thank you for the question. But if we're looking at the vote, it's hard to just, look at the vote like episodically. I think that we have to examine the vote that takes us through the complete, duration of our history in order to put it within its proper context in terms of its ability to be used as something to advance our struggle towards liberation. So I would say that first and foremost, what people always have to understand that historically in Black America, there has always been two Black Americas, so to speak, right? Even during slavery, there was a free Black America, right? Or free, in quotes, Black America, and an enslaved Black America. And this is very important because members of that free Black America could vote up until 1838, when they had the right to vote removed from them. What we saw is that from the period of 1800 up until 1854, there were successive laws that were being passed that were moving towards essentially what it means to be black in this country means that you are a slave, right? There's not going to be any such thing as like a free black person in this country, right? So free black people who live mostly in the North, especially in Philadelphia, had significant rights, but had them slowly stripped away over a period of time, right? So when we look at things like the civil rights movement, a lot of us typically start that particular struggle within the 1960s and then look forward, right? So one of the things that I was doing with the political education course that I taught was I start by expanding the timeline for the conversation as it relates to civil rights, but also in terms of like what those two parallel struggles look like and what the vote meant to one versus what it meant to the other. And the way that I did that, I taught a class down at 6 and Lombard, and the first question that I asked them was this one. I said to them, if I were to say to you that in history, there was a situation where a black woman got onto a bus, and when she refused to get off that bus, a protest started, which led, and a prolonged struggle started, which led to public transportation in that community being integrated, right? 99% of the people, when you ask them that question, when you say, what time period am I talking about? And who's the person that I'm talking about? 99% of the people are going to say Rosa Parks, and you're talking about the Birmingham bus boycott, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then once they say that, that's when I got them. That's when I get a chance to extend the conversation. I'm going to say to them, no, actually, I'm talking about Philly. And the period of time that I'm talking about is during the 1860s, when a sister sat on public transportation. At that time, it was the public streetcar, and when she refused to get up, she sat on the public streetcar for 24 hours, and then they dragged her off. But as a result of that, William Still and Octavius Catto led a prolonged protest, which led to public transportation and the city of Philadelphia being desegregated in 1870, right? So the reason why I do that is because, again, this notion of civil rights is something that free blacks in this country have always had, right? Up until, like I said, from the period of 1800 to 1854, we see a successive loss of their civil rights. We see, in 1838, they lose the right to vote. And by 1854, with the Fugitive Slave Act, they basically state that if you are a black person in America, then you are a slave. So y'all free blacks, y'all can either get out of here or do something else. So when you have that history and you start to look forward, you see that what happens in America is that you have a group of enslaved black people, or the black masses, who define freedom as one thing, and then you have a group of free blacks who define freedom as another. And for them, a part of that freedom was the regaining of the civil rights that they lost, but also the right to vote. Now, the challenge that we've had, and the reason why things are so obfuscated and confused, is that the leadership often that this group of people has is the leadership that comes from this group. And not all the time are their interests aligned. So when we talk about, you asked the question about this past 50 years and what the vote has meant. So I take it from 1870 to 2020. Well, I mean, we can see what the vote has meant in terms of advancing liberation for black people. Specifically, if you look at a place like Philadelphia, the conditions in Philadelphia today for the masses of black people are worse than what they were in 1970, right? And this is a period of time where we've had significant black political representation. Even to this day, our city council and most of the leadership in Philly is black. So it speaks to the fact that while this group of blacks has a certain interests in maintaining the political status quo, that doesn't necessarily work for this group of black people. So this is a conversation that we have to have, because in 2020, I'm arguing that the chasm between these two groups is as wide as it's ever been. That was a long-winded way of answering your question, and I apologize. But
I mean, I think because it raises the broader context. I was as I was thinking about and listening and thinking about what you're saying, and I wanted to get to the power part, but I wanted to raise this, hopefully, and broaden it. Harry Hayward, 1948, said that the United States consists of not one, but two nations, a dominant white nation and with Anglo-Saxon hierarchy and a subjective Black one. Are you saying that even though, and I'm trying to pull it to the electorate, that we haven't in this here divide of free and unfree Africans in the American context, in our social political context, that we haven't been operating as a national unit? And if we haven't, then how have we been operating in your mind?
So when you refer to Harry Haywood, for those who may not be familiar, Harry Haywood is the author of the Black Belt Theory, which basically is a theory that states that Black people in this country constitute a nation within a nation. This is an idea that was popularized by Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, and at the time that the Communist Party was contending with the UNIA in a contest for, who would lead the Black masses, would it be the communists or would it be the Garveyites and the nationalists? What you saw was the communists started to take certain political positions that were popular amongst the Garveyites and the nationalists in order to compete with this particular group. So to answer your question in terms of have we been behaving as a nation, no, because although I would argue that amongst the masses of Black people, and this is the same thing that Harold Cruz would argue, that amongst the masses, our hearts naturally beat towards nationalism, seeing ourselves as a body. But we've had a schizophrenic leadership who wants to impose itself as leaders of this mass or of this group of people, but its interest is in finding a way to essentially make it over into this other nation, right? So essentially, this mass or group of people just becomes a bargaining chip by which our leaders exert power. Their ability to control us, their ability to contain us, is what allows them to advance right within white society, allows them to make themselves a more useful token, so to speak. You know what I mean? So I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but I think that's how I would answer your question initially.
And the reason why I raised that, I wanted to broaden the context if it did that, is because then we get into the political, what some will characterize the political plantation, which the question about in this moment about the vote, right, comes out of. I mean, because we're not tied, and this is a question, in relationship to the vote, we're not coming to the political parties as a body with a demand, but we are being, and I'm asking this, are we being asked to just support within the party one of the two fractions of that white hierarchy of the Anglo-Saxon national structure? And if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say that that's how we are currently used. Essentially, the way that we are currently used within this duopoly is the Black vote represents a foregone conclusion within this political contest between the liberals and the conservatives, or the Democrats and the Republicans. So the Black vote is built into the Democratic Party's plans for the future. They know that they have it. They know that they don't need to do anything for it. So it's something that they essentially leverage for their benefit, but it has never been shown to be able to be leveraged for our particular benefit, right? So if you go back to your second question that you asked about Black power, right, over the past 50 years, and has Black power been attacked? My answer to that would be yes. It's so coming out of the 60s with documents like the counterintelligence program, right, that was incredibly hostile towards this idea of Black nationalism. You don't have Black power without Black nationalism. So what we saw at the end of the 60s, right, was this idea of us coming together as a people to form this so-called Black United Front so that we can engage with this system as a political bloc. But the political interests, right, and outcomes within this particular front were very different, right? You had this front was made up of folks who were conservatives, integrationists, radicals, and revolutionaries. And what you saw was that coming out of the 70s, the integrationists, the conservatives, what they attempted to do was to isolate the radicals, the revolutionaries, the nationalists. So now, essentially, this united front that we have is really only made up of integrationists, because anybody who's a nationalist has been pushed to the side and left to labor in obscurity. So we've had no black power over these last 50 years. We've just had a further and further and further push by the integrationists for them to gain access and maintain the gains that they've made as individuals within this particular system. Now, folks who have been trying to advance black power and black nationalism, again, are laboring, at the grassroots level, but without the support of the community, without the financing, right, that this other group gets. Because when we talk about, this notion of black power being financed by some other group, like that's something that you really cannot have occur. So where we are right now in 2020, when we're looking at all the issues that are facing us, we've seen what integration has brought us. We've seen with the generation of John Lewis's, right, and the Jesse Jacksons, where they have gotten us to, right? So now when we're talking about, the so-called existential crises facing Black America, what I'm arguing is that in 2020, that crisis is not Donald Trump, right? That crisis is the forced migration that we're seeing happening in our community. That crisis is the economic crises that we're seeing playing out in our community. It's the health crises that we're seeing playing out in our community. And I argue the only answer to address that is black power. And there's no such thing as developing black power without black nationalism. So that's why we need a remaking and a reconstituting of the black power movement, and also black nationalist thinking. For the most part, this entire generation, and I take this, my brother Obi Egbuna Jr. has given me this concept of acute spectrum deprivation. And what that essentially means is when we examine the spectrum of black political thought that 99% of black people are exposed to, it's either integration or radical integration, right? 99% of our people have not been exposed to any idea that's to the left, so-called to the left of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, right? Whenever they have these national convenings to talk about the state of Black America, who do you see at the table? You see the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, and then everybody that's to the right of him, right? The nationalists, the separatists, the revolutionary Pan-Africanists, these people do not get invited to the table because the things that they are proposing, the outcomes that they are working towards, are not outcomes that can be attained within the white power establishment that this group has hitched its wagon to. So that's, the issue and where we find ourselves today.
And as I was thinking about you and the team, and I say you and the team because I look from a we perspective, and I just wanted to be clear because we can't do anything. I know a lot of times that we push the I part of it, but it seems that you're been working with others in order to present and do the move forward and raising, some say, the contradiction or the aspiration or the refocus that we have to be in, which raises the question for me, then what is the effect that you want the documentary to have as it relates to Black Power on political formation of your generation and across generations?
So ultimately, the outcome or takeaway that I want folks to receive from engaging with this documentary, the first thing I argue is I'm pushing for folks to opt out in favor of freedom. And what that essentially means is that anyone who was born after 1954 is an integrationist, right? You don't have a choice in the matter, right? You're an integrationist. This is the stream that you were born into. You didn't opt in. You were put in by default. That's the default setting in the Negro production factory, which is America. The default setting is integration. right? So as you get politically aware and start to learn about these systems and how they operate and the way in which you interface with these particular systems, then there becomes a point that I call the choice. And that choice is either you can choose to stay in and try to reform the plantation, or you can opt out and look for other ways and means by which to organize and build power on a local front, right? And that's kind of like what I'm pushing for, because I'll give you a perfect example. We're starting to see small formations develop amongst the nationalists, percolating at the grassroots level, that lets me know that in the next, 2 to 3 years, we could once again have some strong national formations of nationalist groups that operate at both a regional and a local level, but also at an international level, like what the UNIA was in 1920. A good example here in Philly, you have the Diasporic Black Nationalist Coalition that was put together, and forgive me if I'm speaking wrong, but the leadership of Brother Tommy Joshua, Brother Shamari, Sister Lavinia, Brother Carl Tone Jones, Brother B.F. Nkrumah, like coming together as smaller entities who are doing grassroots work that have different projects that are going on, are looking to pull themselves together locally, not to show an alternative, because this is something that Brother Shamari said to me when we were having a discussion. When I was saying that, hey, we need an alternative to the protest movement, he corrected me right in my tracks. He said, they are the alternative, right? Black people in America, or Black people in general, have been living an alternative lifestyle for the past 400 years, because we've been living alternatives to freedom, right? As enslaved people or as colonized people. So like when we say that we need something different, we're saying that we have to move away from the alternative and recenter and ground what it means to be a true self-determined or sovereign entity, which has to be the end goal of nationalism. And as Brother Obi Egbuna stated earlier, that the highest expression of nationalism is revolutionary Pan-African nationalism, meaning connecting our issues at that highest level and pushing forward towards freedom. So in terms of, to answer your question, what I want to see coming out of this documentary is an attempt to expose more people to streams of thought that they haven't been exposed to over the past 50 years. All they've seen is integration, because nationalists have not been able to have a voice. Our ideas have not been able to be put on the table. So therefore, when we're saying things like don't vote, they're looking at us like we're crazy, because they don't have the software to process what it is that we are saying, right? They only have one means of engaging. They only have one understanding of power. And for them, the vote is essential to that. Right. So, and again, this goes back to one of my jugglers, Brother Obi. He said what has happened over the last 50 years is that we flipped it. Whereas the organizing used to be the priority and the requirement, because organizing is what got us the vote. Right. As Dr. Amos Wilson says, we didn't vote to get the vote. Right. So like organizing used to be the priority and voting was the option. And now it's like voting is the priority, is you have to do this, and organizing becomes the option. Right. And then, and even, going back as we see King at the end of his life, as he's moving closer towards a more, revolutionary or radical king, when he starts to look internationally and he's questioning this idea of integrating his people into a burning house. My question becomes, if we understand that the house is on fire, like what logic does it make to say, okay, let me run outside and put on a gas mask and then go back in and run to the 100th floor? The building is on fire. That means it's going to collapse eventually. But your goal now is to go back in with a gas mask on, meaning a political party of your own, and then run to the 100th floor and the building is about to fall. That doesn't make sense to me. So when you watch the remainder of the documentary, I'm going to break out like what I see the choice as, but I'm also pointing to like the real crises that is facing Black America that nobody is talking about. Nobody is talking about the economic crisis that's coming down the road for us. Nobody is talking about the housing crisis, the forced migration.
Come on.
You know what I mean? So I'm just saying, like these these are the contradictions that I'm looking to raise, and I'm hoping that the documentary can be the start of a discussion. But more importantly, I'm hoping that the documentary can serve as like a declarative statement as it relates to the nationalist community and our position towards the vote. So that's what I wanted to put on record.
Now you raised something, I'm trying to go this place. The question comes, then well, one, I agree with the general analysis, and two, I see from a local level, and I don't know others who will be viewing the documentary and engaging. Will they be looking at their local formation, their local political formations, and those individuals that are on the ground that are right now, whether you call it at the embryonic stage or at an incubator stage, that they're looking at them and finding out how they can support in developing or scaling up the activities, because they are organizing. That's the point you're making, right? The question that comes to mind, another broader question for me, is that in this, since we are in this state where the tool, voting is just a tool as it relates to the state in relationship to getting goods and services from the state. Are you saying that there should be, at some point, that nationalist community will be able to be strong enough to utilize the tools of the state in order to get the resources redirected to the majority of African people, and voting being one of those tools? Or are you saying that this delinking process has to be delinked, even though we live in the boundaries, the land boundaries of the state? The delinking is to not utilize any apparatus of the state in relationship to the goods and resources that we have, that Black people are.
So yes, and this is where I'll probably receive the most pushback from everyone. Is that, yeah, I push for a full delinking, because even if we attempt to build a coalition of integrationists and nationalists, which is not possible, if you ask me. And my brother Akil Parker, this is a question he's been raising a lot lately. Like, can we continue as a people to do the both and, or do we have to draw a line in the sand and say either or? Can you be integrating and separating at the same time, right? Because this has been the logic coming out of the 60s, the notion that we can do this both and, the notion that we can engage with this system and build our own. You understand what I'm saying? Like the notion that we can pursue slavery and freedom at the same time has been the prevailing logic or lie or delusion that we've been saying to ourselves over the past 50 years. And one of the things that we have to be real about is, even if you could, so the documentary, right? This is a book that a lot of our scholars are highly critical of, and rightly so. Because it's one of those studies that white people write for themselves to justify their racism and to try to push pathology on us. But even that being said, there are some elements of truth in here that you can pull out. So I named the documentary "The Un-American Dilemma," right? But it was based upon Gunnar Myrdal's "The American Dilemma: The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy." And in here, when he talks about the development of Black voter blocks as a means by which Black people can build power within this nation, he also spoke to the particular barriers or impediments for us establishing a voter block. And one of the greatest impediments that we have is the high availability of basically sellouts and coons. People who are more than willing to leverage the masses for their own upliftment. Like, I mean, there is, one thing that domination does to a people over a long period of time is it corrupts their character, right? When you're always being fed, hand to mouth, sometimes you can't afford to have morals, right? And if you're not like a strong person, then it starts to make you make uncomfortable compromises, right? And that's the nature of so-called pragmatic politics. The nature of it is compromise. So even if we were able to get past the sellouts, even if we were able to get past the division between the integrationists and the separatists, or the nationalists, you know, and the people who want to move on up within this system, let's say we could get past all of that and then form ourselves into a political bloc to negotiate with this system, we would still be negotiating as minorities. And then it will require us to build coalitions that are multiracial or multicultural. So we would have to then, okay, let's go try to connect our movement with the white gays, with the Hispanics, with the white women. We got to build this minority coalition because black people are still a minority. So therefore, in order to get the numbers, we have to do some type of coalition building. And one thing we've learned about coalition building, especially in America, is that the other members of the coalition are not willing to do anything that is only going to benefit black people. So therefore, just the nature of the negotiation that you have to engage in as a bloc means compromise, means milquetoast politics, or solutions that are toothless and don't have the ability to address your problem, because your problem is inherently deals with racism, and the racist institutions that were erected to maintain this country. So if you think that you can navigate as a black person within these racist institutions, like, no, your goal should be for them racist institutions that dominate you, for them to collapse. But more importantly, you have to build your own racial and or cultural institutions that are imbued with your values, with your logic, and with your goals that can support you. So that's what I'm pushing towards. I'm not pushing towards, you know, let's stay in this system. I'm saying let's de-link and build what we need to build for ourselves as a population that is, maybe we're a minority here in America, but we're members of a global community. So that global community needs to be organized wherever it is. Not all black people here in the US are going back to Africa. Maybe a portion of us might go back, but those of us who are here, how are we going to provide those political goods for ourselves that this system will never provide for us? That's the question, and that's the question that needs to be answered, and that's what our solutions have to provide for our people.
You know, well, I think not for and we'll get to, you know, explore more. I get to explore more as far as seeing the rest of the, you know, the documentary tomorrow, you know, to be able to determine the length of the, not just the analysis, but the vision. How do we develop that vision of a sovereign infrastructure that could be able to do that in this unique kind of environment, right? Because you're saying to build something in an environment that has, if it's a colonial environment, that has us captivated at the same time. It seems that might have to be flushed out. So, you know, in my mind, and it raises, you know, maybe personal just contradiction. So even though I'm one who I think I voted 3 times in my life, you know, and I have to say, at first I was dealing with the pain that I felt in this moment, because so many people, and what I've seen on the street of the suffering, I think it's silent suffering going on right now. And the question, and I didn't know if it was the programming of, you know, get rid of Trump was affecting me, or because the structural analysis aligns with what you're saying, but when I see and I walk down the street, you know, and see the suffering and people are treating it as normal, you know, I'm feeling up to this moment that this tool is there, but then the structural now, you know, listening to the rest of us and looking at the structural analysis says, but that don't make no sense in this moment, because it don't matter between, you know, but that's a personal thing, and I have to leave it at, which takes me back to, you know, what I think the, you know, this moment the documentary might bring out. So it raises the question about those of the Black Power, these Black Power formations. What's your assessment of the political weakness or strength of the formations, those who are, you know, at this incubator stage now, right now? And I assume, based off of your premise, we're talking about our internal political strength and weakness. What's your assessment of that?
Oh man, I think there's a few things. One, I would argue the lack of ideological clarity within nationalist formations. Um, we aren't clear, as Brother Shamari would often say, and I think that the fact that we aren't clear speaks to like the fragmentation that you see really within all of our political formations. So it would be the first thing would be that lack of ideological clarity. Two, of course, is the lack of organizational infrastructure and capacity, because we don't see. I mean, we see shining examples uh, that can be replicated as a model. Like one of the models that I point to a lot as the exemplars of what it looks like is North Philly Peace Park.
Mm.
What I see Brother Tommy, Sister V, what I see those folks doing at a microcosm, I see that is a working model that can be developed. But when you look around, right, you have all these people that profess to be, nationalists and or nationalist oriented and are working towards the same goals. But you don't, if that is the case, why aren't they working to help build that infrastructure that this small grouping has already developed that we could build out into a larger a thing? So again, the first thing is ideological clarity. The second thing is that organizational infrastructure. And I think the third thing, which deals with the organizational infrastructure, is just the lack of institutional memory,
Mm.
because many of our institutions coming out of the 60s and the 70s went under repression by the state. A lot of folks, were put into prison as political prisoners. The organizations that were espousing Black power and working towards Black nationalism, with them being destroyed, all we now see is like pockets of knowledge. You see fragments here, fragments there, but no longer a true, organized front. So I think that those are our three biggest weaknesses. But it absolutely starts with the ideological clarity. Because if we are not careful, and I'm critical of some of my brothers and sisters on the left, but am reading is it Harry Haywood, and reading Harry Haywood's critique of petty bourgeois nationalism, I think that he had some merit in there in terms of the ability of petty bourgeois nationalism to become an anti-revolutionary force. So I think that we need a lot more deep political study to make sure that we aren't falling into the traps, those of us in the nationalist community, of petty bourgeois nationalism, where it just becomes a thing about commerce, right? Because we always say, well, we got to figure out the economic problem. Like, yeah, you do. We have to figure out the economic problem, but be very careful not to create a new problem by essentially linking yourself to this
Mm.
system economically, and therefore now you can't detach, right? You can't destroy, because you are relying on it for your economic sustenance, and that's an uncomfortable contradiction that a lot of us do not want to wrestle with. So,
as you're bringing that up, and here go my hopefully it's not schizophrenia, but more what Du Bois called it, double consciousness operating, right? Because it's one thing I find that what you're laying out is the direction that we should stay on target, but we always seem to move our analysis looking at that, what Hayward said, that Anglo-Saxon hierarchy and our relationship to it, compared to continuing our problem identification and problem resolution down the realm of, well, what is it that we need to do to strengthen our organizational capacity, our infrastructure, institutional building, because these institutions
hold
are
on
there.
1 second, Brother Royce. This is Baba Sekou. Baba Sekou.
So,
I'll resend it to you right now. All right. All right. That was Baba Sekou Odenga, so he's having trouble with the link. So let me make sure he gets in. You can keep going,
Yeah,
brother.
yeah. So
Before you keep going, brother Shamari, I know you're going to be moderating the panel or the round table, so this might be a good time for you to tap in, because when he talked about how do we identify those issues and come up with resolution, I think that's a part of your question for tonight for the panel. So this might be a good time for you to tap in with us, brother Shamari.
No, that's funny. I'm not going to do that. But I was sitting here saying, the hardest thing in a moment like this, and maybe Sister Zakiya shares my sentiment or not, is when you have to moderate a conversation that you feel you have a vested interest in speaking, and like how you muzzle yourself and not get in the way of the dialogue, because you're right now we're point guards, right? We can't take all the shots, and we got to distribute the ball. I'm sitting here like, oh man, I want to get in, but I want to give you a shout out for at least representing some of the conversations we've had, man, in such a strong way. The way you synthesize stuff from a lot of different angles, man. I really appreciate how you take those things and put it into a package. So, I'm not going to say, because if I start, man, I won't be able to stop. So I'm gonna stay silent.
So we got a couple of minutes here.
Hey, y'all gonna leave me out here? Both of y'all gonna just leave me out here? We're gonna let you. No, that's what I'm saying. Like, y'all come on in.
Because I was going to say the panelists are slowly starting to show up. I see Brother Tommy. I see Dr. Kemet. I see Minister Rodney Muhammad. I see Sister Lavinia, Sister Natasha, Brother Tori. All right, the panelists are slowly coming into the building. So y'all have heard from me more than y'all need to hear. The reason why we broke it up like this is because we didn't want people just to show up for the documentary, right? We have 12 speakers tonight at the round table. We have 12 speakers tomorrow. Tonight's roundtable is going to be moderated by Brother Shamari. Tomorrow's roundtable will be moderated by Sister Zakiya. So if you're here tonight, come back tomorrow so you can watch the rest of the documentary, because we wanted to whet your palate so you would be excited. But more importantly, I wanted to introduce like some of the most, like I said, politically astute, like grassroots organizers that we see all around the country right now, both in Philly and outside of Philly, like that are coming from a nationalist orientation. And again, I assess their astuteness not by their words, but by their deeds, because their actions is what shows me that they're they've put their political understanding into work, right? And you can see the work that they are doing, right? So that's why it was important for these folks to be part of this conversation tonight.
I would love for you to, play in the space of, I really think we should take some time to differentiate Black power, if there is a difference, in Black nationalism and what we mean by that. And I think that space is important. I remember you saying you can't have Black power without Black nationalism. And I'd be curious to hear some more conversation about that, because they are different dynamics to me. And the other thing, we might not get into down the line, but I think one of the slippery slopes that has happened is that we've turned Black nationalism into something that's radical. I think we made the term radical real interesting and sexy in this idea. And to me, similar to the point about, these other folks are living an alternative lifestyle, that what we're doing is really returning to our center. And I think that Black nationalism and Black power needs to be looked at as not a radical thing, but a normal. Like, this is the normal. This is our normal. And so it's the energy of wanting to be seen and accepted by your grieving father, your father who's treating you bad, i.e. white society, is what makes you radical. That's why you protest and yell and scream, because you want their attention. But if you're really about building your nation, you operate differently, because that's the idea of being radical. That's not really what Black nationalism is about. It's about saying, okay, I need to create my space, whether you want to call it a maroon community or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, I'm going to protect my space. But the other stuff is a cry for attention. It's a cry for inclusion in the very system that we say we stand against or that we live against. And so I think we got to tease. I think where this Black nationalism thing a little bit for me has lost itself is that we've allowed it to be co-opted by the idea that you have to be radical in order to be a nationalist, and we think radical is all that noise making that they're leading us into out in the streets right now.
And it's interesting, when you said that, it brought to mind the point of taking it back, putting it in historical context, which Brother Omowale you made in going back to the 19th century, because isn't that what Henry Highland Garnett, in creating the formation that he was saying at the time, that we have to center from that kind of civilizational, not in the sense of Garvey, but the civilizational perspective, that we have to center our national formation and have an international connection with the continent itself. The thought came to mind. But the structure of that's where the question I was going to ask, and in a few minutes we have, I was looking, thinking of the Cush-Jackson plan as far as a people assembly. Should whether, and I take Brother Samari's position, whether the Black Power, Black nationalists, or the centering should be implementing the Cush-Jackson plan as a means of bringing all these two elements together, or at least a mechanism, which goes back to the Negro conventions or to what they were trying to do in Gary, other than what you were saying, bringing the two fractions together, integrationists and nationalist community, Pan-Africanist and nationalist community. Should the Cush-Jackson plan, the People Assembly, be a mechanism that we utilize, which that formulated out of the RNA, who was actually looking at using the 5 states and coming up with a state formation around the centering of land. Does that make sense as it relates to, moving further into what your documentary and what you're saying, the reason why the vote is a non-element at this point for those who are nationalists, or what you want to call Black Power traditionalists?
That's an excellent question, Brother Rich, and I think it's going to be more than answered with our panelists that we have lined up. So, Brother Rich, I want to thank you just for facilitating a brief Q&A. It looks like all of our panelists, or the majority of our panelists, are here in queue. So if you're one of our panelists, please turn on your camera at this point. Brother Shamari will be moderating tonight's panel discussion. So, Brother Shamari, I'll turn my camera off and hand it over to you, where you could introduce yourself and then move forward with allowing the panelists to do their thing.
Okay, so we're getting a little head start